Have you ever wondered why, in all the wonders of creation, God chose to make us last? Why, out of all the stars, seas, beasts, and beauty He formed, He waited until everything else was finished before He breathed life into mankind? Was it just a matter of order, or was it a divine message? Could it be that hidden in this sequence is a mystery, a revelation, a glimpse into how God sees us and what He created us for? Most of us read Genesis as a story of beginnings, but what if it's more than that? What if the timing of our creation wasn't accidental, but intentional? What if being created last was never a sign of delay, but a sign of destiny? You see, God didn't make mankind at the start. He made the stars, the waters, the plants, and the creatures first. He shaped the skies and laid the foundations of the earth before placing humanity into it. That order wasn't random, it was prophetic. In this video, you're about to discover something many people overlook: the divine purpose behind our placement in the timeline of creation. You'll see how each day built toward something greater, and how humanity was not just formed, but positioned. This isn't just a story about the past. It's a revelation about who you are, why you matter, and how God's design for you began before you ever took your first breath. If you've ever felt like an afterthought in this vast universe, this message will shift your perspective. Because once you understand why you were created last, you'll understand how deeply God thought of you first. Before we dive in, make sure to like this video so others can hear this message too. Comment below what amazes you most about God's design in creation, and don't forget to share this with someone who needs to be reminded that they were made with purpose, with intention, and in the perfect timing of God. What you're about to hear might just change the way you see yourself forever. In the beginning, before time could be counted and before breath ever touched human lips, there was a silence waiting to be filled. And in that silence, God began to move. He spoke, and light appeared, stretching across the darkness like a soft garment being laid across the sky. But He did not stop there. He separated the waters, formed the sky, and gently gathered the seas to let dry land rise. It was not rushed. It was not loud. Each act was measured, like the steps of a builder preparing a palace for someone dearly loved. Grass grew across the fields, trees stretched upward, and fruit swelled with sweetness, not for angels to taste, but for a future guest, not yet formed, but fully known. On the fourth day, lights were placed in the sky, one to rule the day and another to rule the night. And God said they would shine for signs and seasons and days and years. But who would count those days? Who would look up at the stars and wonder what lies beyond them? Not the fish in the sea or the birds in the air. The lights were not made for themselves. They were made for eyes that had not yet opened, for hearts that had not yet beat. Then came the living creatures, the sea filled with motion, the sky alive with wings, and the ground stirred with beasts of every kind. Still, God had not yet spoken to anyone. Still, no one walked with Him in the garden. It was on the sixth day that the waiting ended. Then God said, "Now let's make humans, and they will be like us. They will rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the air, over the tame animals, over all the earth, and over all the small crawling animals on the earth." But why wait? Why not make them first, before the light, before the land, before the beasts? Because the house must be built before the child enters it. The table must be set before the guest arrives. Everything that came before was not separate from man, but made for man. Not because man deserved it, but because God desired it. The garden was not an afterthought. It was a gift prepared with intention. The heavens declared the glory of God, but they were also shaped to be seen. The rivers were not only full of water, they were full of purpose. The fruits did not grow in secret. They waited to be tasted. As God worked through the days, He was not just creating a world. He was forming a sanctuary. And in the middle of that sanctuary, He would place His image. So God created humans in His own image. He created them to be like Himself. He created them male and female. But this moment, the forming of man, did not stand alone. It stood upon everything that came before it. Every color, every sound, every breath of wind was chosen for the one who would walk with God in the cool of the day. Nothing was wasted, nothing was random. The earth did not exist for its own glory. It was the stage upon which the greatest story would begin. Even the soil that held the roots of trees was waiting to hold the feet of the one God would form from dust. The birds would sing songs that ears had never heard, but soon would. The sun would rise on days not yet numbered, waiting to warm the skin of a creature not yet born. And when God looked at all he had made, he saw that it was good. But when he formed the man and the woman, he saw that it was very good, because now the earth had eyes to see its maker, and hearts to return his love. Creation was not just a display of power, it was a preparation of place. It was a promise wrapped in the folds of time. Before man was made, everything he needed was already waiting. The fields were full, the sky was open, and the world was alive. And God rested, not because he was tired, but because he was satisfied. The final touch had not been man alone, but the completion of a plan that began with light, moved through life, and opened the door for love. Not one leaf had grown by accident. Not one bird had flown without purpose. The world was not just ready, it was waiting. And then, when the world stood still in the hush of completion, something unseen yet eternal took its place at the center of everything. God stooped low, not to command, but to craft. From the dust that he himself had made, he formed a figure not like the beasts, not like the birds, but like himself. He shaped a body with care, tracing out hands that could bless and build, lips that could speak and sing, eyes that could weep and wonder. And into that lifeless form he breathed, not just breath, but life, spirit, essence. And in that holy moment, man became a living soul. He did not rise by instinct. He awoke with awareness. He was not called to crawl, he was called to reign. The animals were made by God's word, but humans were shaped by God's hands. The stars were spoken into being, but humans were kissed by God's breath. You made them a little lower than the angels, and you crowned them with glory and honor. There were already kingdoms of light above and living creatures below, but nothing else bore the imprint of God's own being. The man was not like the lion with its roar, nor like the eagle with its flight. He was something entirely different, not because of what he could do, but because of what he carried: God's image, God's likeness, God's design. And when the woman was formed, she was not taken from the soil, but from the side of the man, as if to show that this glory was not his alone. It is not good for the man to be alone, God said. So he caused the man to sleep, and from his side came another, equal in honor, radiant in purpose. Together, they were not merely alive, they were chosen. Everything else had a place in creation, but only the humans were given dominion. Not domination, but stewardship. Not to destroy, but to nurture. Rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the air, and every living thing that moves on the earth, God told them. And in this the crown was placed, not of gold, but of calling. Even the Sabbath, the day of rest, was made complete only after man was formed. Creation was beautiful, but without someone to behold it, it lacked its final echo. The trees stretched their arms upward, waiting for someone to walk among them. The rivers flowed, waiting for someone to taste and bless their sweetness. The garden bloomed, not just as a display, but as a dwelling. Man and woman stood not as intruders, but as heirs. Not as accidents, but as those invited into divine fellowship. All things were under their care, not because they were mighty, but because they were crowned by the one who is almighty. But their crown was not made with human hands. It was woven into their being. They were not gods, but they were not beasts either. They walked in a realm between heaven and earth. They could name what God had made, and yet they themselves had been named by him. Let them be like us, God had said, not in power, not in essence, but in reflection. And in that reflection was dignity that no creature shared. The lion had strength, the eagle had height, the ocean had depth, but the human carried eternity within a fragile frame. Even the angels watched in wonder. not because man was higher, but because man was cherished. He was given what no angel had, dominion over earth and intimacy with God. In the cool of the day, God walked with them. He did not shout from a throne, he came near, and in that nearness, man discovered not only his beginning, but his meaning. He was not created last because he was least. He was created last because he was first in purpose. The crown is not placed at the start of the ceremony, it is placed at the end. And when God looked at all he had made, only then did he say, "This is very good." But though the crown was placed upon their heads, it was not made of pride. It was not given so they might rise above their Maker, but so they might walk with him in wonder. The same hands that shaped the mountains shaped them, and the same breath that stirred the seas stirred within their lungs. This was not a call to self-glory, but an invitation to holy dependence. Though they stood above all other creatures in purpose, they stood beneath God in origin. For he had made them last, not to shame them, but to remind them. They came after the light, after the waters, after the beasts of the field. All was prepared before their arrival, so they would know they had earned nothing. They were to begin their journey, not with self-sufficiency, but with stillness, walking into a world already full, a world already blessed. Even their first full day was not a day of labor, but a day of rest. The Sabbath came, not after their work, but before it. They opened their eyes to a finished world and found that the first lesson was not strength, but surrender. The garden was not a monument to their power, but a gift placed in their hands. The fruit was already ripened. The rivers were already flowing. The animals were already named by God in his heart. Everything whispered, "You did not make this." And the more they looked around, the more they were to understand. Their role was not to boast, but to bless, not to take, but to receive. The voice of the Lord would walk with them in the garden, not as a distant thunder, but as a quiet nearness. In that sound, they would learn that life flows not from creation itself, but from communion with the Creator. When God said, "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden except one," he was not withholding joy. He was anchoring their hearts. That one tree, standing in the midst of all abundance, was the gentle boundary that kept their hearts bowed. It stood not as a threat, but as a teacher. It reminded them they were not gods. It reminded them that knowledge without obedience would break what love had built. And even their form was a sign. For though they bore God's image, they were made from dust. The breath in them was not theirs. It belonged to the one who gave it. As the Psalms say, "You remember we are only dust," not to belittle them, but to humble them into worship. The strength of their limbs was not a sign of self-rule, but of grace poured into fragile vessels. The wind that kissed their skin, the ground beneath their feet, the sun that rose each day, none of these were born from their will. All were gifts, flowing from a fountain they could not control. And so they were to live with open hands. Even the command to care for the garden was not a task of mastery, but of trust. God said, "Take care of it and watch over it." He didn't say own it, but guard it. It was not theirs to rule by right, but by responsibility. This required listening. This required depending. For the moment they stopped looking to the one who walked with them, they would forget who they were. The serpent's whisper later would begin with this very lie. You don't need to wait on God. You can be like him. But that lie only worked because the truth had first been planted. You are not God. You are his. And so, being made last was not a punishment. It was a lesson in posture. From the beginning, they were meant to kneel, not because they were low, but because they were loved. God could have made them first, but they would have seen only an empty earth. Instead, he placed them last, so they would see fullness and fall to their knees in awe. The heavens declared his glory, the earth sang of his wisdom, and man was to listen and respond with humility. His greatness was not in what he could build, but in how deeply he could trust the one who built all things. But even as they stood in awe, humbled by the breath that was not their own, there was something deeper still being whispered beneath the soil. and spoken through the stars. The rhythm of their arrival revealed more than just their place in the garden. It revealed the very heartbeat of the one who made them. For the sequence of creation was not random, and its order was not without reason. Each act of forming, each moment of separating, each word spoken before they came into being. Every single part was a song of divine wisdom unfolding. It was not just a world being built, it was a revelation being revealed. Creation was not chaos, and it was never accidental. It was the unfolding of a perfect design, step by step, breath by breath, day by day. From the first word that pierced the formless deep, light was called before life. Waters were separated before wings could beat the sky. Dry land rose before the trees stretched their arms. The sun and moon were placed before eyes had been shaped to see them. This was no coincidence. This was order flowing from the mind of the eternal. The book of Proverbs tells us that the Lord used wisdom to build the earth. He used understanding to set the sky in place. This wisdom was not hidden in shadows, it was displayed in the very act of creation. And when mankind entered last, it was not delay, it was deliberate. For God was not just making a world, He was revealing Himself through it. Even the rising of the days spoke of a God who works not in haste, but in harmony. The number of days was not too few or too many, but full. 6 days of forming, 1 day of holy rest. In the book of Psalms, it says, "All you have made will praise you, Lord. Your faithful people will bless you." The trees swayed in time. The seas stopped where they were told. The stars stayed in their courses. And all of it taught man this truth: God's wisdom is never out of place. The human heart was placed in a world that already pulsed with divine patterns, that it too might learn to beat in time with heaven. Even in their own bodies, the order was clear. For before man came, the earth had to be shaped, not only as a home, but as a mirror. The soil was not just dirt, it was the material chosen by God to shape Adam's frame. The breath was not blown into birds or fish, but held until the 6th day, when it would be placed into the one creature shaped in God's image. And even then, woman was not made with man, but drawn forth after him, again showing a sequence that whispered of wisdom, not better, not lesser, but deliberate, holy, perfect in order. The prophet Isaiah declared, "The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of all the earth. He never grows weak or weary. No one can understand the depths of His wisdom." And yet in the sequence of creation, He gave us a glimpse. He built foundations before He placed footpaths. He prepared skies before He formed lungs to breathe them. He grew fruit before He molded hands to pick it. This was not just preparation, it was poetry. It was the mind of God turning into visible truth. It was wisdom wrapped in time. So when man looked around on that first day, what he saw was not just beauty, he saw design. He saw a world in which every color, every sound, every shape had its place. And as He named the animals, He did not invent their names from chaos. He discovered what God had already placed within them, for this was the way of divine wisdom, to move slowly, precisely, with purpose. Man was to learn this, not by hearing alone, but by being born into it. Being created last was a signpost. It said, "Look at what I have done. See the order, see the layers, learn from how I build." This was the pattern by which they were to live, the rhythm they were to follow, not a scattered existence, but a life shaped by the wisdom of the one who spoke galaxies into place and left no word out of place. And when all was complete, when the heavens had been stretched and the earth had been filled, when the seas no longer roared in confusion and the skies held their lights in perfect harmony, there came a stillness, not of emptiness, but of fullness. God, in His unsearchable wisdom, had not only ordered creation with precision, but brought it to a place where it could now pause in delight. This was no unfinished labor. This was no tired retreat. This was the holy 7th day, the breath of God resting upon His masterpiece. And it was not until this day of rest was declared that mankind began their journey. Not with toil, not with striving, but with stillness. The first full day of humanity was not spent in work, it was spent in rest with their Creator. The story in Genesis whispers this mystery gently. After the sixth day, when man and woman were formed from dust and divine breath, the very next movement was not instruction, nor task, nor command. It was Sabbath. It says God finished the work he was doing, so on the seventh day he rested from his work. And then it says something even more mysterious. He blessed the seventh day and made it a holy day. This day was not like the others. It was not called good, it was set apart, holy, not for creation but for communion. And here God revealed a truth that the angels themselves beheld in awe. Mankind was not created to labor first, but to relate first. Before they tilled the earth, before they named the living creatures, before sweat touched their brows, they sat beneath the gaze of their Maker and learned his rhythm. Rest before work, presence before purpose. This rest was not sleep. It was not idleness. It was union. The garden was still. The rivers flowed. The trees bore fruit. The animals moved freely. But in the center of it all was a relationship unlike any other. God walking with those he formed. This was not something the beasts were given. This was not something the sun or moon could know. This was sacred, and this rest was the beginning of it. The prophet Hosea spoke of a time when God would call his people into the wilderness to speak tenderly to them. This was that wilderness in its purest form, not barren but quiet enough for the voice of love to be heard. Mankind was placed in this silence to hear the one who speaks without noise, to walk with the one whose footsteps are never rushed. Even when Jesus walked the earth, he honored this rhythm. He said, "The Sabbath day was made to help people. People were not made to be ruled by the Sabbath." His words echo back to Eden, where rest was not a rule but a gift. To be made last was to be invited first into this gift. The heavens had already declared the glory of God. The skies had already displayed his craftsmanship. But now, the ones made in his image were called not to admire only but to abide, not to observe from afar, but to share in his holy delight. This rest was not a break from purpose, it was the heart of it. And when God placed them in the garden, it was not just a place to live, it was a space to meet him. There was no temple yet, no altar, no priest. Yet the garden was sacred ground. The book of Ezekiel hints at Eden as the garden of God, rich with beauty, full of stones that glistened, a place not just of nature but of nearness. To be placed there after everything had been prepared was to be drawn into fellowship, not obligation. The world was ready, but God waited, not for the world to work, but for his children to walk with him. In the quiet of that first sacred day, they learned this truth. They were not alone. They were not abandoned. They were not mere caretakers of a vast land. They were companions, beloved, invited into a rest that was more than stopping. It was sharing in divine joy. And so, from the very beginning, before struggle ever touched the soil, before the serpent ever slithered, before the ground bore thorns, mankind's first identity was not worker, not ruler, but one who rests with God. From the first breath drawn in the quiet of Eden to the final word spoken over creation's perfection, the timing of humanity's arrival was no accident. It was a divine mystery wrapped in order, wonder, and grace. God, in his infinite wisdom, prepared a world not just of beauty, but of meaning, placing mankind last so that we might enter into a completed masterpiece, reflect on what was made, and recognize our sacred place within it. We were not formed in haste nor flung into chaos, but ushered in at the perfect moment to walk with God, to depend on him, to behold his wisdom, to wear his glory, and to begin not with labor, but with rest. Every detail, every moment, every pause in the story of creation gently reminds us, we were not an afterthought. We were the crown placed after the crafting, the echo after the voice, the child welcomed into the home already made holy. If this message about why we were created last has touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to discover the wonder of God's perfect timing and purpose. Leave a comment below, and tell us which reason spoke to you the most. Together, let's spread the awe-filled story of our place in God's creation and invite others to awaken to the deep meaning behind being made last, into rest, relationship, and divine wisdom.